Welcome to AIAS members, to many other participants from near and from far, and from London and from Manchester and Oxford and Cambridge, and also those who've come to us via the classics list. It's delightful to have so many and such a varied audience, and this is the first, obviously, of our 2021 lectures. And as ever, we will continue with this program open to all, with, of course, registration via our administrator. And if you do feel like making a contribution of £5 or more for the lecture, that would be very welcome. You simply have to send it to or contact our administrator, Sheila Ford, who you emailed to get this link, and also the details are on our website. So without more ado, today we are going to Jerusalem, which as ever is an irresistible, and in the company of, we couldn't be in better company. Gideon Avni is the chief scientist of the Israel Antiquities Authority. He's had a very distinguished career there. And he is also a professor of archaeology at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. He's associated with important fieldwork in 3 major areas at least, 4 major areas: the Negev, the Judean lowlands, including Beit Guvrin, Jerusalem, including the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and many other zones in the city, and also Ramla, which was the capital of early Islamic Palestine. He has written an important book by the Byzantine Islamic Transition in Palestine, an archaeological approach. And again, more recently, another important book on Jerusalem in the late Roman period, published as a JRA supplement. So he'll be talking today about urban change in the city, Jerusalem between late antiquity and early Islam, the creation of a multicultural city. Over to you, Gideon.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Tessa and Anthony, and good afternoon from Jerusalem. It's really a pleasure being with you today, and looking at the screen, seeing some old friends and colleagues, as well as other people. Quite a strange circumstances. I guess that in both sides, we are going now into full lockdown. And for me, I think the 4th or 5th time in the last month where I've been attending conferences or meeting in England without leaving my study at home. So there might be some advantages to this, and without further delay, I will try to put my presentation on. Hope you can see it. Can you see it?
Yes, I can.
Okay.
Yes,
so without further delay, I would like to take you for the next 45 minutes or so to one of the questions in the history and archaeology of Jerusalem. And this is the point in which Jerusalem was transformed or created as a multicultural city, and perhaps the very beginning of the process, which is very visible today in Jerusalem, because even without being in Jerusalem, I guess everybody is familiar with this air view of the present day cities encircled by the latest city wall, Suleiman the Magnificent, the 15th century. And when you ask very roughly how Jerusalem is divided, you'll get the answer. Of course, you have the Muslim compound, the Haram al-Sharif, built on the former Temple Mount, the Jewish quarter, Christian quarter, And if you take this question into the ordinary tourist maps of Jerusalem, the division of, well-defined division of quarters, Muslim, Christian quarter, the Armenian, the Jewish quarter, and the Temple Mount Haram Sharif. So what I would like to do in this talk is going back to the point in which this ethnic division was first formalized, and looking maybe through the archaeological data and some historical sources, trying to trace the process of ethnic divisions in Jerusalem from its very beginning. And you're going to see this air view with the circles and the points and stars in different colors throughout the lecture, because I will try to show how things developed generally on Jerusalem, and particularly in single sites which were excavated. Just to put us in the framework, mainly for the general public, just to create the maybe three traditional divisions in the history of the Jerusalem in the first millennia of the Common Era, about the early Roman period, the Jewish Jerusalem. I hope you can see the pointer on the screen. If not, I'm speaking about the upper right figure, the Temple Mount, destroyed, of course, in the year 70 CE, and then Byzantine Christian Jerusalem, which is very much identified with the iconic structure of the Church of the Anastasis or the Holy Sepulchre, and of course, early Islamic Jerusalem, the big constructions on the former Temple Mount, the creation of the Haram Sharif, and the very large palaces or administrative buildings that were constructed nearby. And you can see the kind of timetable and the relevant periods. Of course, there are quite a few subdivisions, because if you refer to Roman Jerusalem, you must refer to Aelia Capitolina, 2nd to 4th century. Actually, the creation of the city as we see today, with the temple located on the place where the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is located now. But the real starting point to our discussion will be Byzantine Jerusalem, best represented by the famous Madaba map, probably middle of the 6th or second half of the 6th century, Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and many additional buildings and churches around. And if to focus more precisely on the transitional period, so we are speaking about the period of change between 6th century Jerusalem, homogeneous Christian Byzantine century, and 8th century Jerusalem onwards, where the city actually started to be divided between Muslim and Christian presence, again represented by the iconic building of the Dome of the Rock, the Al-Aqsa Mosque in one hand, and the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which of course continue beyond the Byzantine period. So it's in many ways, it's the relationships between these two monuments that reflect the process of change in Jerusalem and the creation of this new ethnic division between the city. Now, I would like to start with presenting maybe I would call it the traditional paradigm of transitions or transformation. This section is taken from Beatrice Cassot, article published about 20 years ago in the Glenn Bowersock, Peter Brown, and Oleg Rabar volume, a seminal book, Late Antiquity, Guide to the Post-Classical Period. And if you read this description, quite a poetic one, I should say, you could see the atmosphere. It's the religions in competition in the Roman and Persian worlds altered the society, the societies they encountered. In Syria and Palestine, the currents were the strongest. And then you go to the division. First, the sound and perfumes of pagan processions had filled the streets of Syrian cities. Then the music of Christian hymns and the odor of incense sanctified the urban space as Christians went in processions from one sanctuary to another. Finally, their voices were silenced by the chanting of the muezzin, calling the Muslim to prayer from the minarets which dominated the ancient cities. So you can see, if we can call it the transformation paradigm, the very clear division between pagans, Christian, Muslims, each one replacing the former one. And in this talk, I would like very much to challenge this perception and present an alternative one, which will be based mainly on archaeology. I think this is a beautiful picture of Jerusalem in one of the rare snows that used to fall over the city, present the impact of archaeology on the history of Jerusalem and on the possibility to use archaeology as a source for looking at different points and especially different transformation points in the history of the city. We've been witnessing a growing number of excavations from the very beginnings, 170 years ago, until this very year, approaching the 2000s. Actually, I think Jerusalem can declare as the most excavated historic city in the world, because the volume, the rate, and the number of excavations are, particularly in the last 50 years, are immense, and they create a huge database which can help in sorting all kinds of historical, geographical questions. And I show you again this air view of Jerusalem with the circles and stars, because we will be using archaeology to relate to this question I presented in the beginning of the lecture. How and when the ethnic divisions visible today were first presented. And as a starting point, again, we go to the Madaba map, the last stage in which Jerusalem was a homogeneous Christian city. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre, of course, in the center, but I would like to draw our attention to this big monument, which is the near church, the new church of St. Mary, and to the date of its inauguration, the 23rd of November, 543, according to the sources, and also to the archaeological excavations conducted by Avigad and published quite recently by Owen Goodfeld in a very nice volume on the archaeological excavation in the Jewish Quarter. This date is particularly significant, I think, for us today, because the 543 is less than 1 year from the end of the largest pandemic of late antiquity, the Justinian plague. There's a big debate now on the effect of the plague physically in the eastern Mediterranean. I'm not going to take us into this. Recent work by Lee Mordechai and other scholars question the impact of the plague, but as a matter of fact, when you look at Palestine, Jordan in the 40s and the 50s of the 6th century, you could see in one hand a decrease in the number of non-religious constructions, and in the other hand, a kind of intensiveness of constructions of churches, and the Nia, which its construction started way before the plague, maybe brings us one of the best examples. So in the mid-6th century, we see in Jerusalem the new construction of churches, the orientation of public buildings to the main wide colonnaded streets, the markets of Jerusalem. This is one of the artist rendition of this market presented today in the Jewish Quarter. But the style of the Roman streets is, of course, preserved, and we will relate to this point in a few minutes. Just to give the impression of how big was Byzantine Jerusalem, again, these reconstructions from the north outside of the city. This is, you can see in the upper part, the Damascus Gate, in the far horizon, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and the Nia Church, the very last building facing southern Jerusalem. And just to give you one example of the recent discoveries in the northern area of Jerusalem, about, I think it was 4 years ago, a monumental inscription was accidentally discovered right on the pavement, for those of you who know Jerusalem, near the entrance to the American consulate, not so far from the British School of Archaeology in Jerusalem. And these particular inscriptions in mosaics mention the construction of a building, part of a monastic complex, with the particular mentioning of the Emperor Flavius Justinian and the date 549, 550, again about 10 years or 8 years after the pandemic. And this is only one very small section from a very large monastic area that spread from the present-day Damascus Gate to the north, excavated mainly in the last 20 years, very large-scale rescue excavations conducted by the Israel Antiquities Authority and other teams. And it's particularly relevant to our discussion because in this section of the city, you can see a very clear subdivision between different Christian denominations. You can see it straightforward by the inscriptions. An Armenian compound, which was neighboring a Greek Orthodox compound in very condensed area. I'll just take you back to this reconstruction, and we're speaking mainly about these very large monastic compounds. Those of you who have a knowledge of pottery and glass vessels of Byzantine early Islamic period can see that these complexes continued beyond the Byzantine period. Actually, they were in use until at least until the 9th century, maybe the late 9th, early 10th century, as the evidence of the latest both pottery and glass vessels found in this compound. Now, the first sign of change, of a rupture, of something that disturbed the homogeneity of the Christian city is, of course, the Persian conquest of 614, of which we do have some recent archaeological evidence. One of them comes from the Tyropheon Valley, the upper part of the city of David, a very large area that was excavated by Doron Ben Ami and Yana Chechanovich. And actually, this very week, the final report of the Byzantine and early Islamic levels was published, 3 volumes, more than 1,000 pages. And I'm sure that this is going to be quite a cornerstone in the study of the archaeology of Byzantine and Islamic period in early Islamic period in Jerusalem. One of the most exciting finds in this particular excavations was a very large hoard of gold coins, all of them minted in 613, probably belonged to this event of the Persian conquest, gold coins minted for the benefit of the Byzantine soldiers, if you want, as one of the interpretations say. But it shows some kind of archaeological evidence for the impact of this event. Another evidence we have and was gathered recently from previous excavations is the fact that around Jerusalem scattered are at least a number of thick concentrations of human bones that were put in one single event, in burial caves, in open spaces. And these recalled us the description of the conquest of Jerusalem and the massacre of the Christian population of Jerusalem, Antiochus Strategius, which was translated into several versions. And I dealt with this issue in a detailed paper about 10 years ago, but it gives us the knowledge about the nature of change that the Persian conquest trigger. I'm just giving you one example, the Mamila Pool complex, west of the Jaffa Gate, and nearby the pool, actually between the pool, which is visible here, and Jaffa Gate, which is beyond the right side of this picture, a small chapel, which was facing a cave, was discovered in the early 1990s, published by Ronnie Reich, with the dedication inscription in Greek for those who only gods know their names. The most interesting find was within this cave, and very thick accumulation, about 1,000 people, which were put inside, some of them suffering from death by some violent death by weapons, and the interpretation both Reich and others put for this find is this is one of the evidence for the massacre of Christians by the Persians in 614. But as we all know, the real game changer was the Islamic or the Arab conquest of the Near East and of Jerusalem, 636. This is one of the depictions of Khalif Umar when he was entering Jerusalem. Forget about the smokes and fire. There was no fights going on Jerusalem with the Arab conquest. It was a surrender treaty, and we have the famous story of the Khalif going down from his horse, entering to the city and to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre by walking. But for our topic, this event actually was the point from which things started to change from mono religion, cultural city into this multicultural presence of a number of communities, of course, Christians, newcomers, Muslims, and also the Jewish section or the Jewish coming back to Jerusalem, which was gradually formulated in the second half of the 7th and in the 8th century. And we go back to the two iconic buildings, to the Haram al-Sharif with the massive construction of the new Islamic monuments, and to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and the role in the early Islamic period between the 8th and the 11th century. Just to get the sense of the sizes, you know, these are the plans of the Haram, the Dome of the Rock, and the Al-Aqsa Mosque compared to the Byzantine Church of the Holy Sepulchre. You can see that it is at least 2 times larger than the church. And Oleg Rabar related to the competition between the two monuments in his book, The Shape of the Holy, years ago. And this is one of the main issues when speaking about early Islamic Jerusalem and comparing the two very impressive monuments. You can see here the present day air view of the Haram, which takes you back to this reconstruction from the very same angle, looking how impressive it was in the physical appearance of Jerusalem. Let's say that we're speaking here about sometime around 720, more or less, with the construction of the new early Islamic palaces. And when you go to the present day Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which preserve only a small fraction of the original Byzantine church. This is one of the reconstructions. I'm not going to speak a lot about the church. We have here Martin Biddle and Shimon Gibson, 2 experts on this issue, and it deserves a whole different lecture. I just want to draw your attention to the focus of Christian pilgrimage, the ceremony of the Holy Fire, one of the most spectacular sceneries in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. This picture was taken about, I think, 10 years ago. But for those of you who haven't been in Jerusalem lately, this is how it looks today, after the massive reconstruction of a Greek team led by Tony Amopoulou, who concentrated on the physical reconstruction of the edicule. Unfortunately, it took very little attention to the archaeology of the edicule, and I hope that Martin, who did some work following their work, will publish his result, because we really need the archaeological follow-up on this work, which included for the first time the opening of the tomb of Christ for the first time in the last few hundred years. Anyhow, the big or the major issue with the relationship between the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and the Haram al-Sharif is the additions that were introduced into the church under early Islamic rule. And you can see in the upper part of this plan, this new chapel, which were actually discovered and excavated by us, John Seligman and me, more than 20 years ago, but which gives another evidence for the kind of freedom to conduct changes and additions within and around the church under the Islamic regime. We dated the new chapel to not earlier than the 9th century, and it functioned until the destruction of the church in the 1009 and the reduction of its size. So at this stage, we have a very clear compounds. We have the Muslim one, we have the Christian one, and in the second part of my presentation, I would like to concentrate particularly in this white triangle, white quadrangle area in between, trying to trace the exact border or division line between the denominations. And this question takes us back to the main streets of Roman Jerusalem, of Byzantine Jerusalem, which turned to be the main alleys of present-day Jerusalem, the division of the very wide corridor, the eastern and western corridor, into small lanes, and the dating of these divisions. In the last years, there have been some very minor probes conducted along these alleys, which gives us an idea about the process of change between the typical wide Roman street, 24 meters wide, into these 3 parallel small alleys, each one of them something like 3 or 4 meter wide. So what was the process that transferred this wide streets into these small alleys? In order to give the big picture, we have to leave Jerusalem for just a few moments and go to other cities to see the process of change in the urban framework of cities in the Eastern Mediterranean in general, and Palestine, Jordan in particular. And it takes us back to one of the seminal articles written on this topic. Hugh Kennedy, who is now in SOAS in London, back in 1985, suggested that the process of contraction of the white colonnaded streets started before the Arab conquest. And this was proven by excavations in different parts of Palestine and Jordan. For example, the very large excavations in Bet She'an that showed contraction of the wide colonnaded street, the constructions of a new early Islamic market in the time of the Khalif Hisham. And we can see a similar process, for example, in Palmyra, which follows the same process of contractions of colonnaded streets into commercial, smaller alleys in order to gain more urban space for commercial activities. And actually this diagram, which was suggested already in the 1930s by Jean Savaget, show how gradually the wide colonnaded streets were contracted into small alleys. This is exactly the process that took place in Jerusalem during it started during this transitional period of 7th and 8th century, mainly 8th century. And it can be observed in a number of locations in Jerusalem. For example, at the excavations of the Western Wall conducted by Shlomit Wexler-Bdolach. For the almost 10 years, she's been working there since 2005 until 2016, exposing large sections of the eastern corridor of Jerusalem from its monumental wide appearance in the 2nd and 3rd century through the Byzantine period until its contraction in the 8th and the 9th century into a much smaller alley that followed the line of the same original street. And actually that was the process that was going on in early Islamic Jerusalem from the 8th all the way until the 10th century, and was intensified with the construction of the whole city in the 11th century. Now, looking at this background, I would like again to go particularly to the role of the Eastern corridor as the division line between Muslim and Christian presence in Jerusalem, again looking at the white area. In order to do this, we use archaeology, but I also want to present this early Islamic tradition, the Fadail by Ibn al-Muwajjah, who relates to the event, or maybe a presumed event, that happened with the conquest of Jerusalem by the Caliph Omar. It was published years ago by my colleague Amikam Elad in Hebrew, and in the forthcoming volume of Jerusalem Studies in Arabic and Islam, Amikam is going to present the Arabic source, and I'm discussing the meaning to the urban structure of Jerusalem. So it relates to the point when Omar entered to Jerusalem and he stood in Ras el-Souk and the head of the market at the highest point, and then he was asking, to whom belong this row, pointing to its right, the road of the Draper's Market. And they say to him, to the Christians. And he said, to whom belong the other row, the western one, in which the bathhouse of the market. And they say, to the Christian. And then Omar said, or decided, raising his hand and pointing at us, this market and that market are theirs. That is the Christians. Is allowed to us between the two rows. Now, when you take this tradition and you put it on the map of Jerusalem in, let's say, 8th century, beginning of the 8th century, and you try to figure out where were these streets. So the Ras el-Souk, the highest point of the market, even today, when you enter through Damascus Gate, you can see that you are standing in the highest point of the market, a point from which 3 streets started. And then there is the row of the Draper's Market, which is the eastern one, belong to the Christian. And there is the western corridor of Jerusalem, the largest street we've been just looking at, facing the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and the Nia Church, which belong to the Christians. And then Omar decisions, or maybe somebody of his followers, the middle streets, the eastern corridor of Jerusalem, as he said, and this is allowed to us, to the Muslim, between the 2 rows, the big market in which the Leiden Dome had been. We don't have any clear identification of the building, but putting this tradition into a map of Jerusalem, it makes sense in a way of creating a very clear division line between Christian denominations and Muslim. And so we can go on looking at this basic division, and then of course this line was not a static one. It was a moving line along the centuries, and now we come to this yellow star here, which is located right within the Christian quarter, and it marks the discovery of a very interesting inscription already in the 19th century near the end, near the eastern entrance to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, an Arabic inscriptions from probably the mid 10th century, showing the preservation and restoration of a mosque that was constructed there, and it is known from historical Arabic sources as the Mosque of Umar, showing us that in the mid 10th century, perhaps a little bit earlier or later, a mosque was installed within the very heart of the Christian area. And to end with this division, we come to the third denomination, to the Jewish community, which is represented by these two stars, these two blue stars. And indeed, in the various excavations conducted in the area in between, west of the Haram and east of the Christian area along the Tyropheon Valley, a number of finds indicate the renewal of the Jewish presence in Jerusalem, which is known from the sources. And it goes back also to the big excavations in the upper Tyropheon Valley, the Givati excavation. And I just want to show you very briefly some of this find as we are approaching the end of the presentation. Elat Mazar excavations years ago discovered a building which was decorated with at least one Jewish symbol, the menorah. The interpretation was perhaps a synagogue, or maybe not a synagogue, but a building which was inhabited by Jews. Jody Magnus corrected the date of this building to the early Islamic period, to the phase between the conquest and the construction of the early Islamic palaces. Not far away from there, a very intriguing hoard was discovered, including some jewelry ornament with a very clear Jewish symbols, either the very end of the Byzantine period or the early beginnings of the early Islamic period. And the third evidence comes from this quite famous inscriptions inscribed on the lower section of the western wall near its southwestern corner, psalm from Isaiah, which was redated by Billigen Reich to the 9th or 10th century. It was constructed right above a small cemetery of unknown, of some burials, which is very difficult to assign to a certain community. So this is how we have the division being, and with this we come back to the, I would say, the traditional transformation paradigm, which it's not quite valid to the situation I was just describing you in this lecture. So we have to find some alternative scenarios for these interrelations between different communities if we are not speaking about the replacement process. The other side of the, I would say, of the interpretation, Mattia Giudetti, who published quite recently a book about the relationship between churches and mosques in the early medieval, early Islamic period, he presented the possibility of intercultural convivencia, the kind of harmonious society, tolerant, and an almost a complete absence of friction between different communities. Perhaps this is a kind of wishful thinking. We would like to see Jerusalem acting like this, but apparently that was not the case. In order to see more precisely how things were really looked like in the early Islamic period, we have to go a little bit beyond this area to the outer areas in Jerusalem, in which we have, again, some very interesting evidence of intercultural connectivity in the early Islamic period. I will take you just to two significant points, one to the north and the other one to the south of Jerusalem. This is a monastery which is located in the eastern slope of Mount Scopus, excavated by David Amit and John Seligman, which show continuity of existence into the perhaps 9th century, even later, hosting Christian pilgrims coming to Jerusalem within the early Islamic period. And we do know that this movement of this Christians pilgrimage still existed. The more intriguing case is the case of the Katisma Church, located on the road between Jerusalem and Bethlehem, midway, accidentally discovered in rescue excavations more than 20 years ago. And the interesting thing in this very impressive octagonal church is the introduction of a very small and humble mosque within the structure of the church sometime in the 8th century. So what was going on here? Is it a kind of a convivencia between Christians and Muslims? Are the Muslims taking shape or taking part in the Christian ritual pilgrimage processes? We don't have a clear answer for this yet, but it gives us an indication about how complex was the real situation. So if you want to get another historical proof, you can go to the descriptions of Al-Muqaddasi in the second half of the 10th century, who complains. Al-Muqaddasi, of course, Arabic historian, Muslim, native of Jerusalem, who give very precise descriptions of the Near East in general, and particularly Palestine and Jerusalem. And he complains, how come that the Christians and the Jews are predominant here and the mosques devoid of congregations and assemblies? So we can see that this intercultural, interreligious connectivity was quite complicated. It was not a convivencia. It was not the replacement model, but it reflects a kind of, I would say, mutual coexistence under tensions. But the big story is the creation of a multicultural city under Islamic rule, in which you can see again for the last time the divisions of how the division between the denominations started. It was all under a place where heaven and earth meet, as this by Oleg Rabar and Benjamin Kedar. And at the end, perhaps this is the view that we should look at in Jerusalem, the meeting point between the three continents, and again, a multicultural city created under Islamic rule. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was, you've taken us on a wonderful journey for sure, in time and in space. And as ever, Jerusalem remains elusive for all the increasing number of funds. How do we describe this interrelationship and the changes within it? I'm sure many people will have questions. So Anthony, what is the unmuting drill?
If you would like, Tessa, to, you can either find the person on the screen, or if you click your participants and the sidebar comes up, you can unclick the individual by scrolling down. People are in alphabetical order, first name usually first. So you have a choice of 2 ways of doing it.
Okay, so for the moment, we have no questions. So perhaps I might kick off and just ask if you could tell us a little more, Gideon, about that wonderful hoard of gold coins and the very large one with the menorah on it. What is it and why is it there? And what specifically is that coin?
Well, this is a big question. It was discovered a few years ago by Eilat Mazar when she actually completed excavating the Byzantine complex south of the Temple Mount, which was previously excavated by Mazar and Ben Dov, and unfortunately not published except for some popular books. The big question is the context. I mean, the symbols are very clear, a Jewish one. The question is whether the context is late Byzantine, let's say the second half of the 6th, early 7th century, or it takes us to the early Islamic period, in which a time in which we know that Jews were allowed to return and settle in Jerusalem. At least to my opinion, the stratigraphic archaeological context is not so clear in order to clarify this issue. We're still waiting to the final publication of the context of this. It was widely published in the media and in a very preliminary reports, but we don't have the real context, and we'll have to see the context in order to relate it specifically, whether to some, if you like, Jewish pilgrims somehow going into this area still within Byzantine rule, or to the phase of the renewal of Jewish presence in this part of the city under the Islamic rule.
Right, and who could have minted or produced this amazing object, and in what context and for what purpose?
Well, it has parallels in the in the art representation of Jewish iconography. It's a very well-known symbol, the menorah.
Yeah. But
the provenance or the place of manufacture, it's still kind of mystery.
Yeah, indeed it is. So we look forward to having more news on that. So now, Rabbi Altshuler, if I can
unmute you, should I unmute myself? And my question was simply: is there any evidence on the Temple Mount itself for a Jewish presence? I understand that the Muslims asked the Jews to come back and be a part of the building there for the return of Jews as well as Muslim worship on the temple. Is there any evidence at all of that?
Well, speaking of archaeology, we don't have any evidence of any kind of Jewish presence on the Temple Mount in the early Islamic period. There are the historical tradition about the Muslim being led by a Jew into the former Temple Mount before the construction of the of the temples. What we do have from archaeology is some evidence of construction on the Temple Mount in the Byzantine period, which is very interesting. This came out through a very sporadic inspection. It was published recently in a big article by Yuval Baruch and others in Tel Aviv journal. But looking, of course, nobody can excavate the Temple Mount properly. But all the evidence we do have about the Jewish presence is only around the walls of the temple, but not inside.
Okay. Thank you.
Great. And now, Ilya Semenenko, would you like to unmute yourself? Are you able to do that? I think I have to. Yep.
Good morning, everyone. But unfortunately, I've got a little low internet connection, so I would better stay without my camera.
Sure.
My point is that this presence of several cultures in one city, each with its own temple, belonging to some different, though related cultures, they remind me of the big cities of the Bronze Age, for example, Pyramessa, where also existed several temples of purely Egyptian and also Egyptianized, but Near Eastern gods, for example, Astarte. So it's very interesting to see how this ancient concept was revived in the midst of the first millennium AD. And thank you very much for the lecture.
Most welcome. I think, you know, Jerusalem might be a bit different from this, at least in the first millennium of the Common Era, because basically we're speaking about two main monuments, one continuing and one re-establishing. Because the Temple Mount, the sanctity of the Temple Mount, this is very much presented in this book I showed in the very last slides, where heaven and earth meet. What Oleg Gabar and Benny Kedar did, they traced the traditions on the Temple Mount, Haram Sharif, throughout history, showing the development and showing the preservation and the return to the same sacred place by a different religion. In a way, it exists also in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which was built exactly on one of the main pagan temples of Jerusalem. So there is a point in the preservation of sanctity in location. Of course, in Jerusalem, it's much more complicated because you have, in one hand, biblical stories, in the other hand, New Testament Christ story, and so on. But basically, it goes to the preservation of sanctity as a physical presence in a certain location.
Thanks. And Anthony Shepherd, if you can unmute a question about the Kathisma Church. Are you there, Anthony?
Yes.
Great.
No,
I was very struck by this mosque apparently constructed inside the church. I was wondering, are there any parallels for that? Or had the Kathisma Church gone out of use by the time the mosque was installed?
Well, in the Kathisma Church, it's quite exceptional. We do have other cases. This book I mentioned, Mattia Giudetti, he provides quite a number of cases, and the question is the kind of interrelationship, whether it's a mutual coexistence. In some places like the Damascus, it's probably the best example of replacement. When the main pagan temple became a church, and the main church became now the great mosque of Damascus. But in other places in Syria, in Husayfa, for example, you do have this contiguity between still existing church and the newly constructed mosque. And it appears also in other places. The uniqueness of the Kathisma is that it's in the very same building. This octagonal church suddenly inside, and it's a very small and humble mosque. It's not like taking the major part of the church. And what was the mechanism between people, we really don't know about this particular site.
Thank you. Thank you.
Excellent. And building on Rabbi Altshuler's question, Amanda Borshel-Dunn, are you there? If you can unmute.
Hi, I won't put on the camera because I'm surrounded by family in various states of going to bed, hopefully. In any case, you answered partly this question. I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit more about Christian activity on the Temple Mount following the destruction of the Second Temple, obviously, and prior to the building of the Dome of the Rock, et cetera, et cetera. And we know that there was, of course, activity during the Crusader period, but during the Byzantine period, I understand that there is some evidence that there were several churches up there.
Well, first of all, there's evidence of pagan activity in the time of Ilia Capitolina. Probably one of the pagan temples was constructed there. It's still an issue and dispute between scholars. But as for the Byzantine evidence, for the time being, it's very fragmentary, which means that we do have a number of walls which are quite certainly constructed in the Byzantine period. We cannot speak about churches existing there, unlike in the Crusader period, when the Islamic building were converted to churches. We can speak about a kind of Byzantine activity. But if you look at the Madaba map, you can see that the area of the Temple Mount is almost non-existent. And one of the interpretations was that this was done on ideological basis to show a superiority of Christianity on former Judaism, because actually the Temple Mount Haram Sharif area takes like quarter of the total area of the old city. And it's absolutely not represented in this shape in the Madaba map. But still we do have, and this is the recent evidence of these small probes conducted on the Temple Mount, which archaeologists succeeded in monitoring. We do have, we can speak now about Byzantine presence on the Temple Mount. We cannot speak about, we cannot define the exact nature of this presence, but it was some architectural presence, lines of walls connected to buildings.
Right, excellent. And Nick, Brett, you've been waiting a little. Are you there?
With your
I am. Question?
Yeah,
Hi.
can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Right. I'm quite interested in the Armenians because you showed a fairly early inscription, but were the Armenians regarded as a separate entity from other Christians? And as a follow-up, when do you think what earliest evidence do you have for Armenian presence in Jerusalem?
Okay, first of all, the Armenian story in Jerusalem is very interesting. It goes back to in archaeology in several locations. I can recommend the new book of Yana Chekhanovic, who is present here, who gathered all the material related to Armenian presence in Jerusalem. But speaking roughly, we can see it on the Mount of Olives. We can see it on the areas north of Jerusalem. We can see it on other locations. The indications are going mainly by the Armenian inscriptions, some of the earliest, and also by some material culture. But like other denominations coming from outside, like the Coptic presence in Jerusalem or the Ethiopian presence in Jerusalem, the Armenian is one of the perhaps speaking about interdenomination within Christianity. So the Eastern Christianity and the Armenians are very much vividly felt in Byzantine Jerusalem, and also in early Islamic Jerusalem. So the earliest presence should be traced sometimes in the 5th century, to my opinion. One of the earliest.
So indeed, it's a sort of intra-Christian convivencia here, which is a whole other
convivencia, even in between Christian is a very
yeah, or not. And on that note, we in fact, Nicole Belaish, if you are there, asks precisely about competition.
Yes.
Nicole, are you there? Hello.
Thank you very much, and thank you for our lecturer. You talked very convincingly of coexistence. Do you have clues for religious competition? And I was wondering if the Katisma mosque within the church could be a sign for some kind of religious competition, not only of coexistence.
Well, of course, we do have evidence of religious competition, not so much from archaeology, but from the sources. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre was vandalized, half destroyed. There's the destruction of 1009, the Khalif al-Hakim, this is well known. When you go down to archaeology, it's very difficult to trace this, because if I take you back to the Persian conquest, that for surely created some damage in Jerusalem. This is absolutely invisible in the archaeological record. We wish we could know about the Katisma church, what was the sequence of events that led to the construction of the mosque. But actually, the whole excavation is a very, very shallow one. I mean, the whole story of the Katisma, the 600-700 years, is revealed in something like 1 meter of archaeological depositions. So it's very difficult to trace exactly the process of installation of this small mosque. From the layout of the mosaics, at least my opinion is that it was done in some kind of, I would say, a peaceful process, like reinstallation of some of the mosaics and very carefully not damaging other rooms, like putting the mihrab in the same specific room. For example, not damaging the big apse of the kathisma. So basically, this is the point where we must admit on the limitation of archaeology, about trying to evidence religious competitions through the tools we have, like destruction and so on.
Thank you.
Shimon Gibson, you have put a very cryptic message on about 1063. Do you want to explain?
Yes. Well, first of all, an excellent lecture, Gideon. It was very good. And for those who don't know, he's got a substantial sort of book which does deal with these issues, and I recommend that. In terms of the 2 points I wanted to make, one was in terms of the encroachment onto the streets. What's interesting is in our recent excavations in Mount Zion, we came across part of a Byzantine street, which also had buildings or houses from the Umayyad period encroaching onto the street. So it's the same kind of phenomenon. But the point I wanted to ask you is whether you accept that, yes, in the Fatimid period, we've seen some major changes which do bring about replacement rather than kind of multicultural existence. The Caliph Mustansir in 1063, according to William of Tyre, creates really the Christian quarter, which is devoid of other people. So we have a text which sort of refers to the fact that a deal was brokered, that in terms of the rebuilding of the city wall around the old city from the northwest, in return, the Christian quarter would be able to have that quarter only to itself without Jews or Arabs, and there's even mention of those being relocated out. Would you see that as a turning point in terms of the changes that you've been describing?
Yes, I think I didn't have the time to go into the details of the 11th century, but I think that what happened actually from 1009 onwards is a major change of this equilibrium, the balances. And the 1063, perhaps creation of kind of a wall or some kind of division on a much smaller Christian quarter goes with it very well. Another sign is the construction of the Omar Mosque, or between the 30s and the mid-10th century. So the Christian area in the 11th century was contracting constantly. The balance was shifted, you know, from the times of Muqaddasi descriptions, let's say 965, to the time of Nasir Khosrow visit to Jerusalem, 1047. There are changes in the Christian presence related to Fatimid rule, to the expansion of the Muslim presence beyond this division line which are presented, the abandonment of this outer Christian monasteries. For sure they were deserted in the 11th century. So the 11th century marked the change which predates the Crusaders, of course. So I would say that the big turning point should be precisely put on the 11th century, maybe around for sure around the mid 11th century.
Thank you.
And now Stephen Franklin, if you're there and unmuted. Still there? Or should I ask the question? Stephen Franklin, no? Well, I'll ask the question anyway in case he can't get on. When were Mount Zion and the city of David first excluded from the walls of the old city of Jerusalem?
Well, on this there is a big dispute between scholars. Back in the 70s, Yoram Safrir, Dan Bahat, and others, which published a number of articles. The question goes between again, within the 10th, 11th century, whether it was the mid-10th or the early 11th, but it follows what Shimon said before in my answer to this. For sure, from the mid-10th century, we see the changes and we see the big contractions of the city, more or less to the present size of Suleiman the Magnificent was. So it depends by whom you're going, and it relates also to the descriptions of Mukaddasi and Nasir Khosrow, how you locate the different gates of the city and so on. But this century marks the contraction of the very significant contraction of the Byzantine city.
Thank you.
And now I see I missed a couple of questions. Marie-Henriette Gates, looking for clarification that others will welcome. Still there, Marie-Henriette? The question is, was there any construction on the temple Mount Haram el-Sharif between the destruction of the temple and the building of the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque?
Yes, I think I'm related to this. In the,
yes.
We're speaking of Byzantine construction of unknown type yet.
Right. Great. And Anthony, sorry, I left you out. Rabin.
Not at all. I wonder whether it's at least in part been covered, but I had a sort of general question about the difference between a quarter as a customary place for a community to live and the quarter that may have administrative or legal or other restrictions. And I wondered what evidence, if anything, there was of the latter as opposed to merely customarily living together.
Well, I would be even more cautious about defining a quarter in this, because we have very firm division like a ghetto. You know,
well, indeed, that is the substance of my question. Are we looking at a ghetto here, or is it simply custom that people want to live together who have a common heritage?
I think that, first of all, people cluster together because of common identity and so on. Perhaps the first time when you can see secluded community, also physically, and Shimon just mentioned it, is the 1063 encircling of the Christian quarter physically. I wouldn't go in previous periods saying that the divisions lines were a kind of border. These markets, or even if we take the Eastern Corridor as a kind of, it's not a division line, it's a kind of meeting area for people coming from like the Jewish community from the south, the new Muslim community around the Haram, and the Christian community. So I wouldn't, we have the modern concept of border when you have to create a fence and a gate, and when you cross, you enter into, it's not the medieval ghetto of like Jewish communities. It's more, I would say, the clustering together of people of the same denominations around churches, around synagogues, as you see it in some places today.
Thank you.
Right. Thanks. And finally, just a couple of bibliographical catch-ups. I'll just do them. Marion asks, what was the name of the book shown at the end? Do you remember what you showed at the end?
That was an edited volume by Oleg Rabar and Benjamin.
Yeah.
In Israel by Yad Ben Tzvi, and I think.
So the authors are Oleg Rabar and a couple of others.
Benjamin Kedar.
And it was Kedar, Benjamin Kedar.
2008, if I'm not wrong.
Slicha.
And we have another request to clarify an article. If you'll bear with me for a minute. Where is it now? An article referred to on one of your slides. If I can't find it, perhaps the questioner might
It is
email it.
Avner 2003.
Sorry?
Avner.
Oh yes, thank you.
2003.
Perhaps you're referring to the preliminary report on our excavation in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which was published. No, this is the Katisma. Avner, it's Serena Avner's publication of the Katisma, and there are a number of articles. I mean, anybody who goes into the, the online catalog of the Rockefeller Museum Library would find this under Avner or Katisma. And the final report of the Katisma is coming out hopefully this year. So there's going to be a very detailed volume on the excavations.
Here we are. Yes, it was Avner 2003. Yeah, a fuller reference. So we have it. Thank you very much indeed. And I think, well, with many thanks for answering our questions so patiently and fully, thanks, renewed thanks for a wonderful lecture. There's been plenty of praise as well in the chat, I should say. So can we have a round of applause in whatever way you can manage on the Zoom for Gideon?
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
So a happy New Year, the best of the circumstances for the moment and better things to come to everybody wherever you are, and goodbye and see you all again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.